Welcome to the Red Gauge Podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Kyle. This is Josh. If you could like, comment, subscribe, share, it helps out the show a ton. Today we are joined by friend of the show, Dr. Chris Tabor. Really happy to have you back, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah. So today we decided to try to be a little more focused on what we were doing. So we got a few topics lined up. We're hoping to talk a little bit about, just about like under the umbrella of what sports science can do for us. So we're going to talk a little bit about what science is. We're going to talk a little bit about studies. And then hopefully we got time and we can get into fascia, feet, and sports-specific training and what that actually looks like, which I'm excited about those because I see them a lot in my feed, and a lot of things that people say seem like they're crazy, and so I'm excited to learn and see what's crazy and what's not crazy, because they're things I might know a little about but not a lot. So I'm very excited to learn.
And if you're here just for the feet, it's not that kind of podcast. So go ahead and go to the next one.
Yeah, it's really more about sport performance than anything. Maybe we'll get some anatomical models up here. Maybe I brought something.
Well, maybe it's that kind of podcast. Why don't you watch until the end? Who knows? We sneak it in right at the end.
All right. So, our first topic that we got today is what is science and what can it tell us? And so I teach statistics, so I'm really excited to hear, the lab science side of this definition. I mean, I know that it's probably going to be exactly the same, but do you want to run away with us on what science can do for us?
Yeah, so science is just a systematic approach to discovering some natural phenomena that's happening. So in the case of the scientific method, people will, devise a study, conduct that study, and then they'll try and extrapolate it out to the greater world. So it's just a systematic approach that helps us to gain knowledge and hopefully work towards truth, with a capital T if it's out there. We can't ever know for certain, as anything that is discovered could be overturned. But as we gather more and more evidence, certain things seem to hold in more and more context, and we can be more confident in the decisions that we make from that. So that's all the scientific process is, just a search for truth, trying to discover and understand the world and find out facts that we can apply in different situations.
Yeah, you said one of my favorite things in there that we aren't ever 100% sure. So that's something I go through with as in statistics when we test things. That's how you do the actual math of checking to see is this a true statement or is it probably not a true statement, right? And we really only falsify or reject or fail to reject a claim. So you don't ever really prove anything in science. So when you see when you're reading and somebody's got a supplement and they say it's scientifically proven to help you put on 3 pounds of muscle or whatever, that person is just trying to sell you a supplement. They aren't doing science, right? Because when we make claims in science, they're always falsifiable, right? We always want to be able to test them and see if there isn't a better explanation for what's going on. And that's a really, really important takeaway in the exercise space because we can't ever be certain, Have you, in your training career, was there ever anything that you were sure of, the science seemed like it supported it and you practiced it, and then 5 or 10 years later you were like, ooh, maybe this isn't such a great idea after all?
Yeah, I think the earliest thing that I encountered was when I first started training was the hormone hypothesis for training, where they thought that the hormones in and around a workout window were really important. So you needed to train in a certain way with, for hypertrophy with short rest periods and get the metabolic factors pumping that get growth hormone and testosterone to spike, and that will lead to the gains. Yeah. Well, it turns out that it's not those short-term fluctuations, but the long-term area under the curve. Like the more you train and the longer that you train, the long-term changes in hormones are more important. So that was one. What came after that was got to consume nutrients, specifically protein, 30 minutes after your workout or it's ruined, right? Your workout is trash. You just missed all the gains. Now we know that's not the case. It's your overall protein throughout the day.
Yeah.
And then
How many
recently,
people are sprinting to their kitchen, it's 29 minutes. No, the gains.
They're trying to get the protein in the cup and shake it up so their gains don't disappear. And then I think rest periods have changed quite a bit. So, that has gone from hypertrophy having shorter rest periods to now having slightly longer rest periods. And so those things all had been like taken as, truth, and we've found them to not be as important. So you have to update as you go, as you learn more.
Yeah, a couple of like all of those are ones that, I think because we're, in about the same demographic, right? We all had those experiences going through, but I remember always feeling really uncomfortable about some of them, like the food timing. I was like, it seems real weird that we would be able to survive really well going 2 or 3 days at a time without food, but it would be critically important that in order to adapt to our environment that we would need to eat, within a half an hour or something.
Yeah.
I think that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the research still supports the idea of nutrient timing a little bit if you're like working out multiple times a day. But if you're not working out multiple times a day, it's not really as urgent. Your body's pretty good at buffering carbohydrates and proteins and fats and stuff so that to keep you alive and, in a window and everything.
I think the only caveat to that is if you're an endurance athlete and you delay glycogen, you can actually impair your glycogen resynthesis over a whole day and impact your next day. So it is important to get carbs in early and consistently up to like 4 or 5 hours after your workout so that you're ready for the next day. But it's not the same if you're just doing like a resistance training workout that's moderate and then you miss your protein shake, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
Especially if you're lifting like next day or 2 days later.
Yeah. I do think that there's a huge difference between like your protein shake and your glycogen synthesis and storage, right? Like those are two totally different things. And, we probably should talk about that, but no one knows other than the three of us on the podcast what the hell we're talking about. But they're just such different systems. So
Yeah.
it makes sense that one is actually important, but that's not when people are selling you a protein shake. That is not what they're talking about. Like, they just want you to buy the shake at the gym.
Yeah. I remember research on like so this is kind of like we talked about last time just real briefly the difference between lab studies and ecological studies, right? So like doing stuff where you're measuring things in a laboratory or doing stuff where you're measuring things in the weight room, right? Or on the track or whatever. And I remember reading a study, and I can't remember when it was or who it was by, but they were talking about like ranges of motion for shoulder health and stuff. And so like one of the kind of takeaways was that you should consider limiting your range of motion if you have like shoulder issues, like rotator cuff tendonitis kind of thing. And I bought that one for a long time, and then when I gave up on it and I went back to just doing long ranges of motion and just starting with a pain-free amount of weight and working my way up, like the amount of progress I made was phenomenal. And then all of the issues I had just resolved themselves doing a long range of motion, in a well-designed workout routine and all that kind of stuff. So there's always little things that pop up that you like, you buy onto, and then later on you find out like, oh, these aren't best practices.
Yeah. Well, like you said right there, like what they prescribed would have eliminated your shoulder pain.
Yeah.
Right? Like they weren't wrong.
Right.
Stop going through that full range of motion because full range of motion hurts you.
Right.
But the end outcome, if you want to have a mobile shoulder and still be a functional athlete, like that
it wasn't a developmentally appropriate response, right?
But not everybody, like every doctor and not every physical therapist is going to come from that background or even have like they probably are also like, I need to make sure this person doesn't get injured once they leave here.
Right.
Which is probably not great for our medicine like practitioners to be thinking like nervously, right? Like,
right.
But that's just the way we are. So there probably is a safe way to do it and then a correct way to do it.
Yeah.
Like if you still want to be a functional athlete,
Yeah.
So I did have a question on that. Like when you guys were talking about studies, I thought about this experimental food study that I did in college, and we thought we were really brilliant, and we were halfway through the study, and then we realized like we didn't account for like a pretty big factor. And then so we went to write up the papers, these like huge differences. We were testing if we could put the chemical in like Chinese food that's
MSG.
We put MSG into cakes, to see if we could just, even though it shouldn't belong there, like if people would just eat more cake with MSG, and the answer was yes, they still did, even though it didn't taste pleasing, they took more bites. We just messed it up on the sodium levels, and we were like, dude, this is going to be huge differences. And then by the end, when we actually looked at it, it was like just tiny difference. Like, shit, our paper was so lame. But have you ever actually like got into something, and maybe not something as stupid as that, but like realized halfway through a study that you weren't expecting factor A to be like such a big deal, and like get through and be like, holy crap, like I don't know if this was a great study because we forgot about this?
Yeah, there was one study that we did, and we were trying to replicate the methods of another study.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, my research assistant did not record post-training body weight. So we got the pre-training demographics, but then we needed to get the post-training demographics, and he did all of them except for their post-body weight. So then we lost the ability to do relative strength changes. So we only had the absolute. So then we had to report in the study that due to an oversight, we didn't collect this. And so we had collected the first cohort of people, and then we had like two more cohorts coming up. And by then we had realized that we had missed it. I'm like, there's nothing we can do at this point.
Right.
So we got to run the rest of the study. And it was one of the limitations in the study is that we didn't collect that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, let's talk a little bit about studies, because I really want to talk about replication. You just brought that up. That's a great thing to talk about. But let's give people like a little bit, give people a little bit of a broad overview of like what the types of studies are that we do in exercise science, and what we can take away from them and stuff, and then we can talk about more of the nitty gritty.
yeah. So this is a massive topic to cover, but to try
Uh-huh.
and anchor it a little bit, the two initial types of studies that you could consider, one would be a hypothesis generating type study, and one would be hypothesis testing, with most people being familiar with hypothesis testing studies. However, in our field, because sport is dynamic and we're often working with athletes in their environment, things will arise and naturally that can lead to hypothesis generating. Those are often preliminary studies. They're often conversations you have with the head coach or a strength coach, and they may be presenting a problem that you need to address, and then you look at that through a study. So there may not be an intervention. It may be looking at the data and then saying this is a preliminary analysis showing an issue in sport, and then you would follow that up with a hypothesis testing study. So that's interesting in our field in that we're working from a natural environment and we're just observing, and sometimes we're describing the data. And from the descriptions and conversations, the questions arise that lead to studies that we can actually test at a later time. So that's a nice starting point as two different ones that we can look at. And then you can start to get into hypothesis testing studies. So these are what people would be more familiar with. And these are studies where you go through and you have a question that you wish to answer, you propose a hypothesis, and then you try and falsify the hypothesis, try and prove it wrong. And then if you don't prove it wrong, you have to accept the opposite, which means that you're accepting the actual question that you wanted to answer, which is kind of counterintuitive. You set the hypothesis up to prove it wrong and accept the opposite. And then you can say that you supported or rejected your hypothesis in a study.
Yeah. And then in our space, so I think that's a pretty, I'm trying to think about, I know in my time training, there's been a million times where I wanted an answer to a question and didn't have it, right? And I know also that there's a lot of like really successful and really like engaged in the scientific literature, like coaches and athletes and stuff, who don't always use everything that they get out of studies. Like if they've got something that's working and then somebody comes out with a study, they're like, I'm just gonna back burner that for now because what I'm doing is going okay. How, like, when we start looking at like applying studies to what we're doing, at what point do you start looking at like, okay, this information is valuable enough that we should probably make changes to what we're doing?
Yeah, so it's really important that any one study is probably not the basis for rapid changes in your program, especially if it goes against what you've been doing, or even if it confirms what you're doing. So one study will never be able to answer all the questions that you have, because if it's so broad, it applies to no one. And if it's
Mhm.
so narrow, it only works for that small group. So no one study can answer every single question that you need. So when you're putting them together, new uh, evidence comes out, you want to look at the totality of what's coming out and see how it stacks up. Now, if studies start to mount, with each study that moves in a certain direction, we can be more and more confident with the decisions that we choose to make. So as you go from like 3 to 5 and more studies, you go from there, and it will begin pointing in a direction, and then you can be more confident. In our world, we can't wait for the studies to come out. So we have to make evidence-based decisions based on, historical precedents. But just because something comes out and you're like, wow, this is cool, I'm going to totally redo my whole program based on one study, probably going to have some negative outcomes in the long term. But you wait for these studies to mount, then you can make some very good informed decisions from there.
I remember one of the very first exercise science studies I ever read was about whether it was better to do sets of 8 or sets of 12 if you wanted to get bigger muscles. It was a hypertrophy study, right? And it was a very old study, so it wasn't volume equated. The sets of 12 were doing more work, right?
You're doing 36 reps in the
yeah,
eights
yeah.
and 60 reps
Yeah,
in
yeah.
the
Your
12s.
total tonnage is more, your total time under tension is more, right? But in that study, the eights actually came out on top. Now, this study was interesting because I don't know how often people do this. I noticed that it rarely sees like people give you their primary data when they publish a study. They usually just give you the results. But this study came with the primary data, and there was one participant in the 8 rep group who put on like 12 pounds of muscle in an 8 week intervention. and and if you took that guy out, the eights were much worse. Like if you looked at the clumps, right? There's like the eights were here and then the 12s were here, but there was the one guy who was like almost off the chart that drug the whole average and everything up. And I remember reading that and just being like okay, so these are like they're informative. There's useful information in this, especially if you just go look at that graph that showed, the kind of the upper and lower bounds for each one of those groups and what the means were. It was like, that 12s is going to be a much more dependable intervention, and again, we learned so much more about it now. Like I don't want anybody listening to this to take out that you should be doing 12s instead of 8s all the time. Right, yeah.
Old study.
Yeah, it was an old study. But just in terms of interpreting a study, like it was really valuable that they put that primary data in there. Has there been, I know I don't read as much research as I used to. Like the last 10 years, I probably read less of what's been published as a percentage or whatever than before that. Has there been a movement to like include the primary data more often when people publish their studies?
Yeah, there's a big push from researchers to use an open science framework, which means that you would pre-register your study. You then would get feedback on the study based on how you have it laid out. Then you would conduct the study and you would report exactly what happened, and you would include your raw data de-identified alongside so people could see it on the back end. So that's the big push in science, so people can see truly what's happening. And it also helps to prevent some of the like hacking that can happen in science, like p-hacking, trying to get the result you want from there's a bunch of ways to p-hack, but one is by like doing sub-analysis or items like that until you get the result you want, and then
or
publishing,
customizing your sample size or whatever, right? Yeah, a bunch of things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that framework helps to get everything out there. A lot of people still don't want the raw data out because then people can do their own analysis on it, but that is a push in the field, is trying to get that out there for people to be able to replicate what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be a hugely valuable standard for us to hit, because it can be really amazing sometimes when you get a peek behind the curtain how different stuff looks. I read one time, now I should have prepared for this. I should have looked up this study ahead of time, but it was like a cholesterol or blood pressure medication and that they were trying to put out. And so they had this medication that they'd used forever, and almost everybody responded to it the same way. And then they had this new medication, and they gave it out, and they were like, look, the average improvement is like exactly the same. We can, our medication is a good alternative. But then when you looked at where the people were at, it was like some people got way worse. some people got way better. Like there was a huge variety in terms of like responsiveness to the new thing as opposed to the old one, which for whatever reason just seemed to like everybody was really tightly stacked in terms of their response to the intervention. And so when you look at that, you think like, okay, well, I don't know if I want to take this medication if I'm going to be one of the 20% who's going to get substantially worse instead of substantially better.
Right.
And so, putting out that data is really like can be really useful in a lot of context.
Yeah, and just being able to see like, okay, like this, let's say it was a strength-based thing, but it was all for brand new athletes. Right? It's like, okay, I'm not a brand new athlete. This intervention might not be for me. I'm going to go find a study that was in like intermediate, like trained athletes might be better. Whereas you just see the headline like new bench press workout adds 50 pounds to your bench.
Yeah.
Like, so that is helpful. But I could see where publishing is competitive, so you are kind of putting all your stuff out there. So I could see why some people are a little guarded.
Yeah. Oh, I just had something there. You reminded me of something.
You keep thinking, but like I've listened, I like Dr. Mike, not Israel, but the other guy, the doctor.
You hate Dr. Mike.
No, I like both Dr. Mikes, but he's kind of talked about that same thing. Like not that Ozempic's going to be a bad thing, but that was fully tested on like a very specific type of human, right? Like that, and now we realize that it's weight loss, but it's like it wasn't tested for generally healthy people that just need to lose some weight. So you don't really know like what does that medication do in those kind of people. Like, you probably should also pay attention. Like I would recommend just not being the first wave of any like, just wait a couple years, see what happens to those people. Do they grow a hoof? Like do they make it through? If they make it through, then okay, it's probably all right. But I don't know that me and medication and probably all right. I don't know that that's what I like.
Good.
I say that having been in the military and they inject me with.
Literally
what is that?
everything.
Like, don't worry.
So we talked. You mentioned it's a good idea to look for like a little bit of volume, right? Because people will address things from different points of view. Like he just said, we did this first in untrained subjects, then we did it in trained subjects, and then we did it in a special population and another special population, and you keep seeing that it turns out good, and you're like, okay, this is probably worth looking at. One of the recommendations you often hear is, like wait till you see a meta-analysis about it and go from there. Now, there's some obvious, I saw a meta-analysis a couple days ago that had like 2 qualifying studies. So like, like it just because it says meta-analysis doesn't always mean that it's going to be your baby. So what are when it starts making it to the point where it's reached public consciousness or there are meta-analyses about it, what are some of the like things that you look for in starting to decide whether or not that this is going to be a useful topic?
Yeah. So, underlying all of those meta-analyses are the individual studies. So you have like starting with cross-sectional studies, right? That's like one-off. And then you do longitudinal studies, which contain training studies. So then you get more snapshots over time. And then as enough of those studies mount, then someone can perform a meta-analysis on them, which is a grouping of all the studies together. You then look at the data, you weight them, and you group them for different factors associated with the study. And then you look at where the totality of evidence points you in terms of effectiveness of all the studies, whether for or against what you're looking at. We now live in the age of meta-analyses because of COVID. When that happened, nobody could do any research and everybody was bored. And there were like 4 million meta-analyses on everything you could think of. And that was probably one of the ones you saw with 2 studies in it, which is completely useless. I mean, you get like 400 results and then you whittle it down to 2 and you're like, let's analyze these 2 studies. And you're like, that should have been rejected right off the bat. So in general, once you start getting 10, 20 qualified studies, you can probably run a meta-analysis on a topic. There have been some really good ones coming out of Florida recently related to strength training where they were looking at like volume as it's associated with strength and hypertrophy. And they did a great job of breaking down tons of studies in that regard. So a meta-analysis is nice in that the effects of any one study have less of an influence, especially if they're pretty extreme. And so then you're grouping all the studies together and looking at the averaged overall effect, which is nice, and looking at where it points you. So then you can be more assured in the decisions that you're making following a meta-analysis.
Yeah. If you're somebody who's like interested, like you're really bought into training or you're starting to coach and you're really serious about it, I know that there's some resources out there that exist like Mass, where they go through and they review research and write up articles about it to make it a little bit more digestible because the long form studies are rarely super digestible. Like sometimes even just getting through a meta and reading all of their criteria for what studies they include and don't include, it can be pretty painful. Never mind, the actual statistical methods and all that kind of stuff. Do you have any recommendations for people, places for people to go if they want to have scientifically informed training, they don't want to spend time on bad practices? Like, where do you recommend that people go look for those kinds of things?
Yeah, Mass is a great resource. I really like how they set everything up. They do a monthly newsletter. It
Hmm.
used to be headed up by Greg Knuckles, but now it's Eric Trexler and that crew. So they do a great job. There are other people in the field that put out research newsletters, like Menno uh, Henselman's is his name. I
Hmm.
think he puts
Yep.
out
Yep.
one. And so some other people break down research that way where it comes out and it makes it more digestible. And then, going in to read the studies, when people start to do it, it's just a skill. You can craft it yourself. And you just have to be very critical with how you read it. The biggest problem is if you're not very familiar with statistical analysis, you could get into the results and have no idea what they're talking about because it's written in a format that's not really great for the lay reader.
Right.
So those other resources can help you. But going through the articles, you can read them in a certain way that can speed up your comprehension instead of starting at the top and reading it to the end like a book. You can just start with the abstract to figure out if you even want to read the article, right? You're like, bench press went up by 50 pounds, and then it was like untrained high school kids or like untrained exercise science students. You're like, well, it might have some value, but I've been training for 10 years.
Right.
Like, is this
Uh,
really going to help me that much?
the program
So,
that they were on might actually make you go down.
Right.
yeah,
But
exactly. And then after the abstract, you can just skip the intro, go right to the methods, read the methods of the study, then the results, and then you can read the discussion. And if you need context, go back to the intro. But going right to the methods is going to tell you everything you need to know. And if at a certain point you're like, this makes no sense from the methods for what you're going to do, just stop reading the paper, right? It's probably not worth it for your context to
Right.
go in there. So some of the stuff gets published and it's applicable to that population, but for what you're doing, it may not be applicable. And
Hmm.
there may be some takeaways, but if you notice like major discrepancies from what you're needing, then just move on. There's like a million studies to read.
Yeah.
and with that, like if everything in the gym right now is working for you, and just like you were saying, like don't see one source, like whether it's a study or a YouTube video or an Instagram post. If everything is in the gym is working for you, like take that information, store it away, make a note of it, and don't mess with anything.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's working. Just keep doing that, what you're doing, and then later on, like once you start hitting plateaus, then we could start to get a little bit more intelligent. The last thing you need to do is mess with your gains when they're rolling in. Like,
Yeah.
just keep enjoying it. You'll bang your head up against the wall soon enough.
Yeah. Yeah. It'll stop working at
So
some point.
that's when you could try to get more intelligent about your training. Now, obviously, I don't want people getting injured or doing something real stupid, but yeah, if linear progression in the way that you're doing it is working, just do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd also like to encourage anybody who's interested in reading studies who hasn't really done it before. If you've taken a stats class, that'll make your life a lot easier. If not, there's lots of great resources. You can find a good description, almost everything on YouTube. And don't be daunted by it. Like, I teach statistics, and I regularly will read a paper and be like, I've never heard of this method before, and then have to go, look up, like, what is this particular tool? So, like, and I used to work in research, and that happened to me when I started teaching statistics, because when I worked in research, my scope was pretty narrow. So the tools that I used were all, pretty well defined. I had a small set of wrenches that I used really regularly. And then when you go to teach, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're going to show you abroad. We're going to get into screwdrivers and pliers and everything else. And then, when you get into research, you're like, hey, we need a slide hammer for this. And you're like, well, what's a slide hammer? Like, so I think it's fair, to give yourself a little grace and know that, like, Like when we do research, we go looking for right tools. Like it's a, that's part of the job is figuring out how to describe this as accurately as we can. And so a lot of times it's new for people who are doing the research too. So like
Yep.
don't be daunted by the fact that it's new and difficult.
Or you could be like me and find a guy like Cofield and become friends with him.
Yeah.
And he'll read the research and he'll tell me what the hell they're talking about.
Yeah, make
Yeah.
friends with a nerd.
That was so before I took the head coach job last year, I was sitting waiting for a PhD program to start and I was really excited. But the first class, you don't even get to take other classes. It's just one class alone that says understanding scientific literature, and it was his own class. So like if you don't understand it, that's fine. That's a PhD level class, just understanding how to do it. So yeah, it is. If you're not into statistics and stuff, it might be difficult.
Yeah,
Like,
but it is doable. You can do it. If you're excited about it, you can do it.
both these people are smart. You might
So I
not
got
be.
two comments here.
Yeah.
One was on your comment about not changing training. So one thing that I always have to tell my students is that as part of the studies that we run, we do ongoing testing and monitoring of the athletes. Sometimes we don't do anything different. We don't change anything. We just watch and see what happens because training is probably going to work in some aspect. We only begin to modify training if things are trending in the wrong direction. So sometimes the tests that we use and the monitoring is confirming that training is going well, and it doesn't need to be adjusted. If something is working, don't go in and manipulate it. The head coach is putting these practices together. The strength coach is doing a lot of good work. You're confirming that the work that they're doing is going well. We don't need to do anything. We're just course correcting when things might be trending in the wrong direction. And then the second thing is now with ChatGPT being open access, you can copy any section of a research paper, drop it in ChatGPT, and tell them to explain it to you in as simple terms as possible. And it will just spit out an instant result. So if it's just this crazy statistical test that you've never heard of and you have no idea, it just like makes you black out when you read stats, type it into ChatGPT and tell them to explain it to you in very simple terms. And it will take a very dense academic chapter and it will clarify it. And then if you have more questions, just re-prompt ChatGPT and it'll be fine.
Yeah, it's gotten pretty good. When it first entered public domain, it wasn't great about math, but now it's doing pretty darn good about describe, especially when you're below the level of like differential equations and stuff. It does a really good job of explaining things. Yeah, great resource.
All I could think of was that we had a colleague that put out that she had the most wonderful student letter ever, and we were reading it and we were like, that seems really like poetic, you know what I mean? And put it into ChatGPT. Does this seem like something you would write? And it was like, absolutely, this is something I've written. It was just some ChatGPT letter that some kid, which I guess is still sweet, they thought about. Like, I want to give a nice letter, but I can't write one. Here you go.
That kid turned in every assignment in AI for like 6 months. I went and talked to his teachers about it. He did a biology presentation that had no content about biology. It had animations and it was pretty and all that kind of stuff, but it was like, biology is the study of biology. Like none of the content meant anything.
Just like super long and deep. Yeah.
Do you see that much
use it as a tool. It's a tool.
Yeah. Do you see that as a college professor that people will turn in something that's obviously just, it doesn't mean anything?
Yeah. The rules for trying to catch people using ChatGPT are difficult now, but because there's multiple large language models, you can run them through different ones and be pretty assured that people are writing them that way. But there are very common mistakes that sound very ChatGPT oriented when people write them. And you can also tell when they're trying to write academically, if they're using words that sounds like a thesaurus threw up on the page and they don't talk like that normally, you'd be like, come on now, did you put this in ChatGPT? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, this writing is like well above the level that I expected of you. And then they'll like say, yeah, I did do that. So it's very common in school. And now like ChatGPT is the most common. But what they'll do is they'll take ChatGPT prompts, they'll copy it, put it in another one, run it through there so it rearranges it, and then they'll put it through a third one. And then you can't really tell that it was done and it won't flag as AI, but you can tell that it's like very polished and high level writing.
Yeah, it's interesting when, again, going back just 2 years or whatever, but I remember it being easy to tell that it was ChatGPT because it didn't have its own voice. Like, it would be long sentences, short sentences, long sentences, short sentences, big words, small words. Like, whatever that was, it wasn't really smooth. It kind of read like it was written by four different people. Um, and it's gotten like the voice, it's gotten a little bit more of its own voice, but it's definitely kind of long-winded. Like it doesn't give itself the abbreviated version of stuff, you know. Um
Yeah,
oh
went down a rabbit hole there.
yeah.
My bad.
Oh hey, I do have a thing, a soapbox. So own personal soapbox for students in the world because I'm also a teacher. There's a like in the history of education, there's been a lot of conversation about whether we should focus on like facts and figures or whether we should focus on critical thinking. And that's not a real dichotomy. That's a false dichotomy. You can't think critically about something that you don't know anything about. So like if we got on here and we got super deep into like the mechanisms of, hypertrophy or whatever, there's going to be a pretty small group of people who are going to be able to even access that conversation, right? Like because once you start talking about, the role of arginine or whatever in your in your tissue growth or whatever, you're just going to lose a lot of people. um, it is worth it to know stuff. So like if you're a student and you think like, well, what's the big deal? I can just punch this in or whatever. When you're faced with actual like field questions, when you're the one in charge of making decisions, if you don't know stuff, then you're gonna have a bad time. So like learn as much as you can so that you can participate in the critical thinking part of it, because if you don't, then you can't, you know.
That, yeah, America.
Yeah.
Whatever side you're on, up, down, inside, outside, like
Learn stuff.
learn stuff,
Yeah.
then talk about it critically.
Yeah.
There's a message for everyone to take home right there. You didn't realize you were saying that when you were saying. I was like, yeah, that's a really good point, Kyle. Learn about some shit and then talk about it. But anyways, we'll cut that out. Don't want to get political.
Now we'll leave that in.
I was right. I was pretty in the middle. No one knows.
No one knows.
Monroe's an amoeba.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really tough now. A lot of people are afraid to be wrong. So what I notice with most of my students, I have about 60 people in class right now for my big strength conditioning class for undergrads. And the same five people talk because they don't care about being wrong. Everyone else won't ever say anything because they are afraid to either speak out in front of their peers. But the biggest issue that I see is that they only focus on route memorization of facts.
Uh-huh.
But that's only one layer of knowledge. That's just called recall, which is a very base level. It's like you
Right.
learn a fact and you can recall it. Like when was the War of 1812, right? In 1813. But when you go beyond that, then it would be like synthesis and then there's application. And
Right.
that's where critical thinking comes in. And students struggle when you go beyond the route memorization. So in our field in particular, critical thinking is necessary because there are such divergent sports. What
Yeah.
applies for a long distance runner and a shot putter are completely different. So you need to be able to take a contextual approach to it, know the concept, and then build upon it. So then when you're talking about metabolic conditioning, you know when and how to scale it up and down. And that's one very difficult thing in our field is moving from this is a fact and then how do we apply that fact in practice? And so I run
Yeah.
into that with my undergraduate students in that they're afraid to be wrong and move beyond those very basic skills that have been hammered into them since they were a kid. So then I
Yeah.
try to give them context questions and then they start to see how it applies. And then obviously all of my master students probably get annoyed with my tests because they're all set up like that. But
Uh-huh.
I demand that they can recall and do this in situations because they're strength coaches. They're going to be doing it. So I want them to be informed and be able to work with athletes all across the spectrum. So I think that's
Yeah.
an important point that you brought up.
Yeah, and it again, like the knowing stuff is a prerequisite, but but doing the analysis is definitely a critical, like it's a skill, like you got to practice it. And I think the only way to practice it really is to be willing to be wrong. So like you got to every once in a while pipe up and be like, this is what I think, and then you can get some reframing if you weren't quite in the right zone.
Yep.
It would be nice if I mean that's probably like an education reform issue that needs a lot more attention, is that it's not only is it okay to be wrong, it's good to be wrong because we learn faster when we make mistakes.
Mhm.
So like but people don't always celebrate that.
And not only like wrong, but like when we have a conversation, even if I agree with you, a lot of times like, and I'll just start it off, be like, I'll take the counterpoint just so we could have a good conversation
Mhm.
and push the counterpoint, even though it's not something that I believe, but okay, if this is your side, what's going to be the other side? And then at the end of the conversation, be like, yeah, like, I totally agree.
Right.
Like, it's
Yeah.
just, that's a skill. That's a very good skill to have in life, is to be able to like take the counterpoint. And I actually think it was my college professors that did it. It was in cell biology, and it was a debate was part of the final. Half was oral. It was an oral final that you had to stand in front of the class and he would give you a topic, and you just had to tell the class as much about that topic as you humanly could. You had no idea if you had passed the A level, B level. You just had to keep going. And the other one was a group debate on very controversial topics. The most controversial, abortion and everything.
Should
like,
we recycle old people?
right? Like yes, like all of them. And then at the debate, which on that campus was one of the most well guarded secrets, is he makes you do the other side.
Mhm.
So the debate is not in front of anybody; it's just in front of the professor. So you walk in and you have to debate the other side. So mine was on abortion, and I was on one side, and they were on the other side. And you walk in, and now you have to debate the other side.
Yeah.
But guess what? Since I knew so much about what they were going to say to be able to like rebuttal and counter their points, I was able to fully and heatedly debate the other side.
Yeah.
But that's good. Like I knew the whole thing, right? Like in a subject, I actually knew both sides and where both sides came from, and the strong points and the weak points, and like you said, that's critical thinking, right?
Right.
You just don't learn your side and the other side's wrong. Like you probably should know both sides to any issue.
Yeah.
It doesn't really, and we don't get that much in strength, but we somehow got to life, and that's probably more important right now, the way we are, anyways. But
Yeah. Yeah.
you want to get to some feet stuff?
Yeah, fascia and feet.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can.
it's a good transition right there.
Yeah. I mean, we're
Life
45
lessons.
minutes in.
Yeah, it's about time.
Well, before we move on to fascia, feet, and sport-specific training, is there anything else, like any like real tidbits of wisdom that you've got about like engaging in the science? Oh, wait, before we even get to that, I got one more question in the realm. So,
Okay.
because you mentioned it early and I wanted to get back to it, was replication. So, can we talk a little bit about the value of replication, and have you seen anything? Like two-part question. Have you seen anything in the field where they went? Everybody was doing it because it was the study, and then they went to replicate it, and they were like, "Uh-oh."
So I haven't seen that in particular, but I will
Okay.
tell you that right now, there is a group called the Sports Science Replication Center that's
Yeah.
out of the UK. They're running a massive, wide-scale replication study following the same format that occurred in psychology when they promoted the replication crisis, and now we're doing it in our field. So
Yeah. Can we
that
talk a
paper
little bit
is,
about that? Can you introduce
yeah,
the replication crisis in psychology? Because it's
yeah. So
wildly interesting.
yeah, so they ran all these studies that we took as like gospel in psychology. And then what they did was no one ever followed up to do it again in a different group to see if it stuck. And so what occurred was a group got together, they picked these studies, and then they ran replication on them. And what they found is that most of them did not replicate.
Mm-hmm.
So a famous one that people might know is the marshmallow test study. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you have a little kid and you put a marshmallow in front of them and you tell them like if you eat it now, you just get one, but if you wait, you get two. And then they looked at the kids and then some would just like eat it in 10 seconds. And then the others would wait and they would get the other marshmallow. And then they looked at long-term outcomes, and the kids that could delay gratification had these different things. That didn't replicate. A bunch of studies didn't, and it called into question a lot of the results from studies that were taken. And so it opened up people's eyes to the fact that a lot of the studies in different contexts, when the methods were redone, didn't come out the same exact way.
Yeah.
So
And
following that, we went to sports science. And now there's a large scale replication whole process going through about this very topic. And they're in the final stages of putting their manuscripts together. Our site Sacred Heart University was chosen for one of the replication studies. So we replicated a training study, and we only were able to partially replicate the results. So we, from the way they set it up, were told to look for this one result that was pre-registered and whether we could do it or not. And we were partially able to replicate that study, so not fully.
Yeah, so the reason I was so excited about that was because of the social sciences replication crisis. So this is one of the things that happens when you're trying to publish research is that if you do new research, it's easier to get funding, it's sexier, people are going to be more excited about it, it's going to get more views when you publish it, more likely to get awards, whatever, right? When you replicate somebody else's study, it's more likely to get a thumbs up and then people are going to move along with their day. You know, they're going to be like, hey, cool, nice, you did that. Unless you replicate it and it comes up crazy, right? And like happened with so many of our sociology studies, right? Or psychology studies. So when you go looking to do a study on a group of humans, it's a little bit like lighting a pool of gasoline on fire. You know, like people are volatile. You get a large variety of people, and the responses that you get can be pretty significantly different. And so like when you light that little pool of gasoline on fire and you're like, it's gonna go up the same way every time, and then every time it goes up a little different, you're like, oh, what do we do now? Like what was actually important in there, right? And what wasn't important in there. And so, yeah, it's been a really interesting thing to see. So I'm excited to see. I didn't know that there was that there's been a big push in strength science or sports science to replicate studies, but I'm excited to see what comes out of it.
What was that group called again?
I believe it's called the Sports Science Replication Center. So
Tell me to write it down.
look that one up. They have their large manuscript out with all the studies that were required to be in it. So that's under review. I'm sure it will come out in the next year.
Yeah.
Funny enough, we replicated a study from a journal, so we sent it back to the exact journal, and they rejected the paper. We did the same exact study. I'm like, you don't want your old study back? I'm like, what? Like, what? How did this happen? So I had to send it to a different place. It's currently under review. But I was just like, you don't want your old study back, the one that you published before?
Yeah, they're like, seem good enough.
Yeah, they're like, no, we already published that one. It's already been said. Why would we do it
move on
again?
to something else.
Yeah, it's time for something new. Yeah. So that's another part of the reason why it's important to take individual studies with a grain of salt, because you got to reproduce them. And even when you get into looking at like meta-analyses, I saw one. My sense of time is so terrible. 2 or 3 years ago, where they did a meta on protein recommendations. And on it, they had a really, really interesting graph that had this kind of like line of best fit that was kind of like logarithmic. So like no protein was no growth, right? You probably die after a little bit. And then as you went up in protein, it went up really fast to about like 0.4 or 0.6 grams per pound or per kilogram or something. And then it kind of started
1.6 grams per kilogram.
Yeah. And then it started to kind of like taper off after that. It didn't, I don't remember if it ever went down again. Like it seemed like it still had a slight, upward trajectory. But when you looked at the actual data points that made that up, it was a cool graphic because they had their curve, their line of best fit. But then each one of their like individual data points was a study. So it was, had bounds for like upper and lower effects or, standard deviations or whatever. And, like getting that data out of there, it's like, oh, there's actually a pretty big range where you can be successful. Like I don't think it's as, hypercritical that you hit, a gram per pound or whatever the, the thing
Right.
was that you thought you should hit, right? Like if it's a little less, you're probably going to be okay. If it's a little more, you're probably going to be okay. Like it's not going to be a life or death, but it is really interesting to see those because it shows how fuzzy working with a group of people are, right? Because it was this, it's this growth curve that seems like it just keeps going up really, really small increments after a certain point, right? Like not to the point where you're going to want to try to get 4 grams of protein or whatever, but it was also like the whole thing was hairy, so like you might be somewhere in there up or down depending on who you are or what your intervention is or all those other kind of things. Yeah. All right, should we move in? Do you have any other words of wisdom about like any favorite advice or topics or anything that you want to share with people about studies before we move on to some actual training stuff?
Do researchers have a favorite study? Are you like, God, I fucking just love this study?
That's
Is
2
that a
questions.
thing? Sorry, but I just thought of that.
All right, so First piece of advice would be I would encourage anyone that's at like in school to try and do research at some point just to see how it's done and see the value in it and how hard it is.
Uh-huh.
So if you can reach out to professors and see if you can get involved, that would be great. I do not have a favorite study type, but I love training studies. So going in and getting the training done like in a very specific way over a period of time and getting people in and seeing the subjects change, those are some of my favorite. They're the most difficult ones to run just due to the
Mhm.
length of time and how involved they are, but training studies are by far my favorite because then you can begin to control certain things and you make it look more or less like regular training. And I feel like they're very valuable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as you were saying that. I don't. You probably get some of the best training. Like if you're sitting there and you're controlling like every variable, like if you have it on like velocity or a way to like see how much like maximal effort that they're putting into each rep, like just being able to see that level, I'd imagine you're going to get really good results. Just because like, you know, like we just got into coaching and like I'll give the program to my person, but I'm not there. You know, they say what RPE they did a squat at, but like there's a lot of variability just between my program and their effort. Whereas like if I was standing over them, like clocking the speed at which they're lifting or something like that, you're just going to get better results that way. So that's interesting all in and of itself. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is interesting. Like in training, we often talk about, specificity, volume, frequency, intensity. But one of the dials that isn't talked about a lot is feedback, right? Like the more supervision that you can give athletes, like usually the better the adherence and the more effort and the better the outcomes. And so that is kind of like a lurking variable in studies of like, hey, they are in a supervised environment, not always. I mean, sometimes they're training on their own and stuff,
right, it's
but
just feedback.
yeah, but a lot of times they're under a watchful eye, right? And like half the people that we've talked to about why they got into the weight room, it was like to look better for girls or whatever, And so and so,
Right.
think about how much harder they work just if there's somebody else in the weight room they care about, never mind knowing that they're for posterity. It's part of the future.
Yeah. Yeah, like this would be the last like thing, but I wonder how like what percentage of programs are followed.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? Like what is the actual percentage? Like if I gave you a program for a week, like how much of that program did you actually do? Like how many reps did you cut? How many sets did you cut? Did you go start playing basketball? Did you add your own crap in?
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, I didn't tell you that I do jujitsu 4 times a week.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
or our boy who would do bench press every day regardless of what the workout was.
Yeah. So there's little things like that. Just fun little thought. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Had another you sparked a little flame in my brain there, but then I lost it. It's okay. We'll move on.
Well, the transition, because we forgot this last time, and we're gonna run out of time if we get into feet. I know that's a big topic for you. So, we got to get in. We got to sneak in the Monroe's random question because we may or may not have forgot it in the previous episode. We'll go quick.
Okay.
Favorite hero of all time.
Favorite hero of all time.
Yep, that's all I'm giving you. You could go. You can go from that. Could be you could say Superman. You could say your dad.
Oh.
Favorite hero, George Washington. If you're a big Giorgio fan.
If anybody out there hasn't heard the George Washington song, I highly recommend going and looking it up. It's terrible but hilarious. He'll save children, but not the British children. Who's my favorite hero?
Favorite?
You said we'd go quick, but hero. I'm having a real hard time here. Okay, so I'm gonna take this one. My son the other day was regaling me with stories from history, and so he reminded me of the time that Russian sub lost contact with command, and they just about launched their nukes, but one of the 3 people who had to agree to it refused to do it, and so that one guy prevented World War III. So I'm gonna go with that guy.
That guy, random, Russian sub man.
His name starts with an A. I can't remember though. I keep wanting to call him the name of one of my foreign exchange students, and so I know that that's not the right name. I got my gears fumbled.
I'm going with Bruce Willis's character in Armageddon.
Okay, Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Because
AJ got the short straw. He's going out there. He's going to be the one that has to die on the asteroid.
Yeah. Pulls
his air hose, throws him back in, lets him go live his life. Saves the planet.
Saves the planet. It convinces NASA that it's easier to teach them how to be astronauts than it is to teach them how to operate a drill.
Absolutely.
And then operating the drill was just running it.
The astronauts would have failed, though.
I'm sure.
They would have failed.
That was the moral of the story.
Yeah. Drillers over astronauts.
Yeah.
That's my favorite hero. I was going to go with Forrest Gump, but we talk about Forrest Gump a lot.
Okay.
Yeah. I can't even remember the guy's name. Starts with an H. Anyways, you got one better than that?
No. I mean, my hero would be my dad, but
You went sentimental.
if you got to go with like a historical person, it would
like
be a hero.
my guy.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's funny. Like my pick, I don't actually know anything about that guy. Like he might have been like a racist who beat his kids. Like he might have been a terrible person otherwise who just didn't want to start World War III. I don't know. So, but
That's
just,
still a pretty heroic thing.
Yeah. But that one day, he really redeemed himself,
Absolutely.
no matter what else was going on.
Yeah, that was a big moment for him to not go with it because it was going to be over after that. He's like, maybe we should just hold off here a second.
Yeah.
5 seconds longer. Dad's a good one.
Yeah, Dad's a good one.
Yeah, Dad's a good one. I mean, you threw out George Washington. We probably wouldn't all be here in the United States having a great time if they didn't decide to tell the king to go shove it and write that document. So we can go with the founding fathers as some heroes there.
I hope that's at one point in time what was said.
Yeah.
Thou shalt shove it.
It's
I don't know
like
if they still talk like that at that point. It's not that long ago.
The letter's like an acrostic, so like just the first line on each sentence is just spells out "shove it" when you go down the side.
All right, here's an anti-hero just to tie this section together to give people a laugh. So there was a court jester. He was they call him like a wit. So his job was to insult the king and make him laugh. And so he got a little bit excited one day and he smacked the king on the ass and he insulted his wife. So then the king decided to put him to death, as they do.
Yeah.
But because he liked him so much, he let him choose his own manner of death. And the court jester chose to die of old age. So he had to exile him from the kingdom. So there's a little anti-hero story about someone getting the better of a king.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. That's the grains of rice story too. You can have whatever reward you want. He's like, today I'll take a grain of rice, and tomorrow double it, and just double it every day after. He's like, okay, deal. And then it turns out to be 32 billion grains of rice or whatever.
Very quickly.
Yeah. At the end of the month. Okay. So the couple of things I'm real excited to get into are fascia, because so I'll give a little preface, right? I've been in the weight room for 23 years on and off. And there's been a lot of things that have kind of come and gone, as not like fascia is a real thing, like it's a part of your body. I'm not saying it's not a real thing, but like there's been a lot of like things that have popped up in the studies and been like, hey, check out this cool thing we can do. And then you come along about 3 years later and nobody's doing anything about it anymore, or there'll be one little takeaway that's really useful that becomes just part of something that everybody does, but it's not really like a transformative thing. But over the last few years, it feels like fascia, feet training, and sport specific stuff's always been like, as long as there's been sport, there's been people touting sport specific stuff. But those couple things have really been like really present, but tied to a lot of people who aren't really academic. And then the approaches and stuff that I see that go along with them aren't like something that really fits in my mental model of how we train people and how we get better. And so I was really curious just to learn. This is really Kyle gets to pick an expert's brain about sports science, about what do we know about fascia? How does it assist in our performance? What can we do to train to improve those qualities? Just kind of like an overview of, if this is something that you're interested in looking more into, how do we go about starting that conversation and looking at that as a training modality?
Something we're trying to do. Explain what you're talking about. What is fascia? Where is it located?
Yeah. Okay. So
we're making foot jokes.
I always love giving the layman's definition and then having it overruled. So
and I think it was Chris I think it was this episode when we had you on last time. Afterwards, we started implementing trying to explain.
Uh-huh. Yeah. We start scaffolding. So whenever we introduce a new term, we're going to explain.
I told
it
Kyle afterwards, I was like, 50% of that episode, I was just looking at you two insanely lost. And I know a lot more than most people know, like an average human knows about this. And I was just like, I don't know what the fuck is going on here.
Yeah.
Man.
Okay, so I'm going to give my best definition as I understand it, both like from what it is and then how we view it in sport. And then I really look forward to being very wrong. So you can start out with you're a big dumb dummy and tell me all the ways that I'm wrong. So fascia is like in the context of the human body, it's connective tissue that like holds our envelopes our muscles, connects everything. Our whole body floats in an envelope of fascia, right? And so it's the structure of our body. It's it's a pliable tissue. It's very strong. So if anybody out there's ever made ribs, one of the first things you do is you peel the fascia off the back of the ribs. Like it's a it can be a very thick or very thin layer of connective tissue that we use. From what I've seen, and again, I've not researched any of this, so this is a completely uninformed take on how it affects our ability to perform in sport. But because fascia is elastic, right? Then when you are doing loaded movements like throwing a ball or jumping, then there's an element of being able to load fascia to assist in the sport that you're doing, and it does. I've seen a little bit that suggests that like it's something that's more well developed or less well developed in people just kind of naturally. Like the people who can throw a baseball 100 miles an hour, it's not just the amount of fast twitch muscle that they have, but also like the thickness and everything of the fascia that they have, and that might be like a genetic thing, right? Like something that you kind of have or you don't have. I don't know. Again, all of this is just me spitballing little bits that have made it their way into my brain.
It's like a human squat suit.
Yeah, like a human squat suit. That's a great analogy. Great analogy, as I understand it. Yeah.
That's how I'm now thinking of it.
It's a built-in squat suit. I don't know. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that like because it's passive, you most likely would only get the benefits when you start getting towards end ranges. That's why things like throwing a baseball would be, because you really are like stretching everything, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm really excited to learn. So, Dr. Tabor, do you want to run us through what fascia is and what we can do with it?
I liked your definition. It is a connective tissue. It envelops the muscle. It also breaks muscles down into different compartments, and then within those compartments, so you have the endo, epi, mesonym that surrounds the muscles. That's fascial tissue. And so there's one on the outside of the muscle that holds the muscle together, and that would separate that muscle from ones next to it. So if you think of like the quads, there's 4 of them. They're each going to have their own sheath. And then inside there's bundles. So they're going to be wrapped in connective tissue. And so it helps us to organize our muscles into a very streamlined process. There's also fascia in different areas wrapping like groupings of muscles together. It is a plastic tissue, which means it can adapt. To what extent and how much is unclear. The biggest issue I currently have with the whole fascial movement is how do we measure it? And that has not been resolved. Many people say you cannot measure it. I'm like, great. Well, what do we do with that then? So it is present. There is evidence that fascia can adapt within a muscle. So there's no reason to believe it couldn't adapt on the sheath due to mechanical stresses placed on it. You brought up a very good point that there is a genetic component to it. Some people may have thicker, more elastic fascia. Others may have thinner based on genetics. That's going to have a very big impact on performance. And it can most likely be adjusted with long-term training and the types of training that you do, whether you're like sprinting, running, if you're lifting heavy weights, the mechanical stress is likely going to impose a demand that would cause it to adapt. What's unresolved is what does the adaptation look like? How much does it adapt? And across a career, like what does it do to your performance?
Yeah.
If you think of something very simple like powerlifting, maybe the fascia gets very thick and allows you to transfer forces more readily into the barbell because all your muscles are now working together in concert through this thick fascia. It's allowing you to store and reutilize energy. That might be the case. Whereas in other contexts, Maybe it becomes more elastic, allowing you to transfer energy more quickly. It might make you more bouncy, right? So I think it's context specific, but there's no real way to measure how much it changes because people don't like you peeling their skin off and looking at their fascia and then putting it back on. So it's
Normally.
very hard to measure that. There may be ways to look at markers of fascial growth, like underlying blood markers might be a possibility. I've not seen that. It may exist. There might be a way to do some imaging to look at it, but that's going to be very expensive and time consuming and not something that most practitioners are going to have available. You don't just have an MRI in your garage you can fire
Yeah.
up and then put the athletes in there.
Well, I would think that it would be really hard to measure change. Like it's hard enough to measure changes in muscles, and muscles grow pretty tremendously, right? Like
Mhm.
you can get somebody to double or triple or quadruple the volume of a muscle, across their training career, right? But like fascia is just like it's, you know, again, if you ever cooked ribs, right? It's the thickness of a piece of paper towel or something in a lot of cases, and that's a pretty thick piece of fascia. So like how you would go about measuring those seems like it would be really difficult considering how hard it is, with ultrasound to measure muscle thickness. Like you still get into a little plus or minus, and that plus or minus might be all the growth
Yeah, it
that
might
you
be
would
the whole
get,
thing, right?
Mhm.
Like if we're starting with the paper towel and we increased it,
10%.
yeah, 20% of
Yeah,
a thickness of a piece of paper towel, like which might be tremendous growth in your sport,
right.
but then also over like what amount of time, and then over time does it just naturally thicken? You know what I mean? Like you're saying, like even if your team did have an MRI, like how long is the study going? And you're just going to have to kind of throw crap at the wall at the beginning to see what, if anything, does like, oh, this group, we've seen some changes. What was that group doing? So, like, it seems like a pretty hard thing to get into to try to study.
Yeah. And so like, but that's kind of what they would have to do at this point is just biopsy stuff, or like, take them apart to see how much it's changed. Would that, or are there other options, other measurement tools?
I don't know if you could gather it with a biopsy because you'd only be punching one individual area of the
Right.
muscle and it may not be uniform. And then there's
Mhm.
going to be different layers of fascia. And the way it adapts like longitudinally is probably harder to measure. So if I had to guess, like speculating because I haven't seen it, there may be a way to train and then look at the markers of growth from that fascial tissue. It's going to have a specific protein associated with it, and you
Mhm.
could look at the upregulation of that protein. I imagine if you made it good enough, you could get an MRI to measure that layer around a muscle that you were interested in and do pre and post measurements.
Yeah.
And then you could take some actual human tissue out and then run those layers in a lab. But it would be very difficult and very invasive. So that's why I think at this time it's hard to know how much it's changing. Other arguments I've heard is that in order to cause changes in fascia, you need very large forces, more than could
Uh-huh.
be tolerated by people. And so, how much it can adapt is hard to know. That's why I took a longer term approach. Like that constant loading over years probably has a specific outcome, whereas like short term changes are probably going to be less robust. But when people are saying things like we're breaking up the fascia and they're like putting their hand on your leg, like they're not even close to
Yeah.
manipulating any of that.
I think that's a pretty important part of the conversation, right? Because we have like basically two structural proteins that make up most of us, right? Like collagen, and then what's the other one? Um, flipping, I'm drawing a blank right now. Elastin, is that right? Or am I just saying elastin because the other one's more elastic than collagen?
There
I'm
is
gonna,
elastin and collagen. I don't know if they're the two most abundant. They might be the most abundant outside of actin and myosin,
oh, okay, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Covering everything up. Yeah.
Right, yeah, yeah. That's important context, right? So like I'm thinking about just like support structures, right?
Yep.
As opposed to mechanical ones.
Yep.
And I know that there's a big variety. Like I grew up with a friend who had like hypermobility. So like basically her body just doesn't produce collagen. Like it's all elastin, all of her, everything that's put together. And then, I think that we've all been in sport long enough like to deal with athletes who just like, they're like people who are made out of wood, like they just are extra stiff all the time, even in a relaxed state.
I'm
And
collagen as fuck, dude. I'm getting a shirt that says that, dude.
So, I don't know. Again, I don't know, and I mean, and maybe this isn't, worth having the more conversation about, but like, if fascia is more one than the other. If fascia is more collagen, like the amount of force that like a sheet that would cover your quads could handle would be like a tremendous amount of force. Like in order to actually like cause mechanical damage to it would be huge, like hundreds or maybe sneaking up on 1,000 pounds or whatever for a big quad, right? And
Yeah.
so when you start talking about like we're gonna break up your fascia or we're gonna stress, I would be surprised if it didn't respond to training. Like I always take things to like an absurd level. Like if you took somebody who'd been in a coma for 3 years, like I don't think that they would have as much fascia or as thick a fascia. It has
Mhm.
to change because it is a pocket for your muscles. So if your muscles get bigger, your fascia has to grow with it, right?
Yep.
But again, to what extent I would be really curious, and then how it affects performance.
I think
I would
that
be really
the
curious.
how it affects performance, I think, would be so hard because you're not going to be able to isolate it from
Uh-huh.
the muscle.
Right.
Like, how do you just take the muscle out and just test the human squat suit?
Right.
Like how do you test a squat suit without the human in it? Pretty
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
then you have your tendon and your muscle that have elastic properties of them, and the fascia has elastic properties, so you can't uncouple them. So even if
Right.
you did something that measured stiffness and like your bounciness, you couldn't take them apart. So I've seen people producing courses now on how to train your fascia, and so I find them interesting. I mean, they make some like good points. It just seems like sound training would take care
Uh-huh.
of it. And a lot of people are then getting out of just one plane of motion. So they're doing like rotational work. They're trying to get in the frontal plane and transverse plane and out of the sagittal, which there's no reason to not do that.
Yeah.
Um, is it training the fascia in a slightly different way? It could, but I mean, if your program is well rounded and you're putting people into positions they haven't been in, introducing new degrees of freedom, the body will adapt. And it might just be, could be fascia, could be neural, could be skill. So I think as long as you're doing sound training, the fascia will take care of itself due to the specificity of the demands that you place on it. And
Hmm.
there's probably a genetic component where people might have like more ability to adjust compared to someone else. They might be more elastic or not, just like you mentioned. So at this point in time, I'm a bit skeptical. I'm always keep an open mind. If someone comes out with a way to measure it and then we can show that it changes, like great. Like I'm all about learning more about it and following that where it goes.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something there that's also like a really important takeaway for thinking about body systems just as a whole. Like we have a tendency to describe things as pretty quantized bits. Like it's, this is what the muscle does and this is what the tendon does. But when you get into like how they're actually organized in the body, the where one ends and the other begins is a little less clear. Your tendon just kind of goes into the bone. Like it's not like it like sits on top of the bone, right? It's like laced into it. And every other tissue kind of has the same, there's not really like there's not always like really clear transitions from what one job is to what another job is. Like they're very much working together to make movement happen. And so it is hard to separate it and say like, oh yeah, well this is the tendon's job and this is the fascia's job, and it's like, okay, well the fascia becomes the tendon and the tendon becomes the bone, and the
Yeah.
bone becomes the ligament, and like what do you mean? What do
So
you mean?
yeah, at this point, like the way that I would listening to you guys talk about it, like the people that may or may not even need to worry about this would be like, are you trying to beat the number one sprinter on the planet because you're the number two sprinter on the planet? You've tried every single thing. Maybe it's worth
Right.
worrying about, but for the most of us, the other 7 billion of us, probably just train an intelligent training system. You're probably getting the best out of it that we even know.
Yeah.
Even if there is benefits for it, no one knows it yet. So there's not. If there's somebody's training about it, they might be giving you good training, but they probably don't actually know if they're affecting the fascia or not.
Yeah.
Like, doesn't mean it's bad training. Just like Chris said, like, could be really good training advice, but it might not be doing what they're saying they're doing. But if it's working, again, just do it. That's fine.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
don't call yourself the fascia king, the fascist. Definitely don't call yourself that.
That might play
that's
well.
gonna be
Actually, I was like, that actually,
You might get a big audience on that
we're
one.
getting a decent
You
audience.
better
I think I just
coin
found
that.
I just
You
found my
better
alt account.
trademark that. That
Yeah,
sounds like the best parody Instagram account ever. It's called The
The
Fascist, and
fascist.
it's just like a human fascist suit who's just like calling people out.
we're gonna have to delay publishing this episode till I can put together that alternative Instagram
That's
account.
awesome.
This isn't episode 20 anymore.
That's awesome.
Oh.
Okay. I feel like that is a pretty good primer on fascia. If you're really interested in it, keep an eye out for more research. Maybe somebody will figure out ways to delineate. I mean, there's always, reductive measures to get an idea of what's going on. There's plenty of ways in science where we look at something indirectly by what's not there or what's happening in other systems. So, maybe somebody will get a good handle on it and publish some really interesting stuff, and maybe it'll be really useful for those elastic actions, throwing a shot put, jumping, throwing a baseball, whatever. So, if you're interested, keep your ears out, but don't pay $50,000 for the fascists to come coach you. Or do, you know what? I'm not in charge of your wallet. Yeah, you can do whatever you want.
Whatever you want.
Yeah.
There's a lot of actually good training that came out of some fascist countries. So
Now you're rethinking it. You're like, you know what? This might be the underlying success. We've really gone off the rails. All right. Can we talk a little bit about like foot training? And I love to give another primer again because I like to be wrong. So this is something that I'm actually I'm a little sold on as a person. I don't actually do any specific foot training, but I had flat feet when I was growing up. I had lots of stress fractures in my feet and ankles growing up that were, related. And then like knee and hip pain because stuff always moves upstream and downstream when your body's not working right. When I was like 20, in my early 20s, I managed a gym and I started working out barefoot. And like a lot of that stuff went away. I noticed when I get out of the shower, I used to get out of the shower and I'd step and my footprint was just like an oval, and now when I got out of the shower and I stepped, it looked like a traditional footprint, right? And so like my foot, it changed the way that it interacted with the earth and then, the rest of my body. I wear I'm giving them a plug for free. I wear the Zero shoes, and they have there's just an eighth of an inch of rubber and they're super wide toe boxes. And I got them, and within like a week, hip pain that had been bothering me for 10 years went away. And so I'm a little bit sold on the idea. I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the research because generally speaking, if you want to get stronger, there's principles that you can follow. And so I wasn't super concerned about what the foot research was. I was like, I'll just train barefoot and, enjoy my life. And so I've been doing that stuff. I've really enjoyed it. What do we know about the value of shoes, of training your feet, getting stronger feet? How does it affect our sport performance? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? All that kind of stuff. You wanna run us through it?
Yeah, so in the past few years, there's just been this renewed interest in the feet, not just from people trying to get pictures online, but from a training standpoint. And so at first I was like, why are we talking about this so much? I see people doing exercises where they're just the ball of their foot's on a plate and they're holding a static position. So I did look into it a bit more, and the muscles in the feet are adaptable, just like you mentioned. They can become stronger. They adapt to the forces that are placed on them. And for most sports, the interaction of you and the ground is with your feet. So if your feet are lacking in strength, they're lacking in mobility and the ability to perform their functions, then yeah, you could be leaving some performance on the table. And because of that, for certain sports, it's definitely something that you should train. Now we wear shoes that, for better or worse, restrict the movement of your feet. And for that reason, if you're wearing tight boots on a soccer field, ice hockey players wear really tight skates and lace them up really tight. Interestingly, snowboarders, you don't think about them much, but they wear very thick boots that are strapped into the board. And across the season, they lose strength in the feet and their calves. Their calves will actually atrophy because their foot is locked into the boot. So for some of these athletes, part of their training will be retraining the feet to become stronger, more resilient, and adaptable. And so that's the idea behind training the foot for certain groups, is to restore the function, as that's the interaction of you and the ground. And so there are a wide variety of exercises that you can choose from that will build up the muscles in and around the arch of your foot, the smaller intrinsic muscles in and around there in the ankle. providing more stability and aiding in performance. So when we went from not knowing whether something can adapt in the fascia, now we're moving towards the feet. And this is something that can adapt because they're muscles and they're going to respond to mechanical loading. Does every single athlete need to do foot training? Maybe not. Some may need more than others, depending where they are and the shoes that they wear, the job that they might work if they have one, if you're wearing like restrictive type dress shoes, and then the nature of the sport. As we talked about, certain sports are going to restrict the movement of the foot and ankle complex. They're probably great candidates for foot training.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was really surprised by how much just the shape of my foot changed and everything when I started working out barefoot. Like I lost a whole shoe size. Like it sucked up the arch enough that I went down from, like a 13.5 to a 12.5 for shoe size. And that was just the wildest thing ever to me. And then it also like got visibly wider. So like anytime I need shoes, I got to go somewhere like what's the widest thing that they got. And I just thought it was a really, really interesting experience to go through where, like, for my entire life, everybody was like, you need good ankle support and a big heel. And, like that was just kind of the convention. And I've often wondered how we got to those spots. Like, did we just make shoes that look good? Is the heel there because of horses and we never got rid of it? Like, why did we make the choices that we did that got us to where we're at now? I also, and I don't know if hopefully you're more familiar with this study than I am, and if not, it's fine. But in like the early 2000s, there was a podiatrist who was working with like plantar fasciitis, and he went and biopsied like 100 people who had plantar fasciitis. And he was expecting to get like the same kind of results that you would get when you biopsy like a patella tendon when people got like jumper's knee or whatever, right? Where there'd be markers of inflammation and stuff. But instead, all the markers that he got was that the tissue was like hypoxic, so like it was dying from lack of blood flow. And I don't know if they've like gone all the way back around and like they have a better understanding of why that's happening. I remember at one point, one of the theories was that because your toes are supposed to be splayed out when you pull your thumb across, that it's like the tendon, that the muscle that brings your toe in and out, that it would press on an artery that
it's like
supplies blood, right?
Essentially,
Yeah,
like...
yeah, and so it's restricting the blood flow to the sole of your foot, and that it might be what was causing it. And so I don't know if that's the thing that they ended up settling on, or if there's other research around that. But it was just really interesting to me, the idea that like we're supposed to be like this, but because we're doing this, we're causing ourselves a huge amount of problems that, probably don't need to be there,
Yeah. Well, if you think about the hand and feet, like everyone knows that your grip can get stronger, right? You train your grip. Your intrinsic hand muscles can get stronger, and you can make your hand thicker with training. Like your hand can get physically larger. And people also know about carpal tunnel, right? The sheath around the tendons in your hand can get inflamed, and that restricts some of the inflow to your hand, causing problems if you're not in a good position. Well, the same thing can happen with your feet. If you're not training them, they're going to atrophy. Plantar fasciitis can come. If you're not getting good blood flow in the area, you're not sending nutrients and removing waste products, then that's going to cause problems. So there's probably value in certain times of the year, getting out of the shoes, training your feet through the exercises. That there are many like resources you can just type in, like training for the feet. Now they're out there. I think Cal Dietz has a whole setup on it that's available for people, and doing that can help restore the function for the people that need it. And it's probably a good thing to do in the off season, just to break up some of the monotony of training. And if that's a underlying performance factor, then definitely train it for your athletes, because you would hate to leave that off the table when it's something that you could easily fix with doing exercises that just need to be adjusted in their execution, where you can train the foot and the other muscles at the same time.
Yeah. And a lot of it's super easy to do. Like I just don't wear shoes in the weight room, right? If I can jog on a treadmill, I don't wear shoes. Like it's not really hard to get a huge amount of like progress. I'm not even doing any special stuff, and it's been really, really great for me.
Yeah, it's probably pretty easy to notice. Like, take your shoes off and then like walk across the room on your toes, or just like try to jog across the room. And if that's really difficult or painful, like you probably are a candidate, like to probably needing some, which would be, Mr. Collagen over here.
Yeah.
Like, it's terrible, right? But Just talking about it makes me.
Makes your stomach
And
turn a little bit.
make sure you're going into a weight room that's fine with you taking your shoes off. Don't just be showing up to Planet Fitness with your
Yeah.
nasty feet.
Yeah.
So,
And again, now they make a lot of shoes, so like, I mean, the shoes that I wear, they're essentially moccasins. They just have a rubber bottom, and so that it doesn't really feel much different to have the shoe on or off. Cool. Do we have you?
I don't know if we can get it. That's a long one. I would rather, yeah.
For the sport specific training?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I feel like that's it.
Can you guys handle it? I'm fine.
I mean, that's fine. Yeah. Just going along.
I can do it. Yeah.
I just don't want to rush it.
Okay.
I mean,
if you're okay, we're okay.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. All right. So, last topic, and one of my favorites, because again, I got into the weight room for sport. It was track and field was my baby. I love throwing heavy stuff a long ways, and so training. I really fell in love with training because of sport. And then I stuck with it long after whether or not I'm competing in anything else, I'm still training because it's the best thing ever. But that was my entry point. In my career, I had some very interesting experiences in terms of what paid dividends and what didn't pay dividends and what was like common practice that I don't really think is worth doing anymore. And so I'm really excited to talk about this last topic, which is like, training for sport, like what is it and what do people think it is, right? Mm-hmm. So do you want to give us a little primer?
Yeah. So recently, there's been this huge emergence in functional training. I'm going to use that in quotation marks. Like there's a functional training system. They're like, this will carry over to sports performance more. And they'll have like somebody on a Bosu ball catching a tennis ball. And they're like, functional. So when it comes to sport specific training, the most important thing to know that the most sport specific training you can do is the sport in question under game like situations. Playing your sport is the most sport specific thing you can do. Each level you work back from there will be less sport specific. So I've often hear coaches say, you're lifting in the gym, there's no squat racks on the football field, right? Because it's like far removed from it. But when we start to talk about sport specific training in the context of being off the field and what you're doing in the weight room, there are ways that something could be more or less specific to the sport. And the easiest way to do this is to go into the concept of dynamic correspondence, which was detailed out by Anatoly Bondarchuk. He had different exercises that work their way back, and there's criteria for each. And if you use that framework and you understand that the gym provides you general capabilities, that you then go to the field and transform them into sport-specific outcomes, it seems to make more sense. So certain exercises that you choose, due to the nature of their execution, are probably going to do better and have more carryover than others, even though it does not necessarily look like exactly what you're doing on the field. Mm-hmm. And so through intelligent program design, you can pick the exercises and the executions of those exercises to better mimic the demands of what you expect the athlete to do, thus raising their force generating capabilities that they can use on game day.
Yeah. So when we're looking at that, Anatoly Bondarchuk's one of my favorite coaches of all time, just because of how much he kind of pushed things forward. Like he was a high volume training guy, high frequency training guy. He, like you said, he was the guy who published pioneered the idea of dynamic correspondence. He has some books out that you can go and get. They're older, so a lot of the stuff has, we have kind of updated understandings of a lot of the things, because is he in his 80s now? He's getting up there. Mm-hmm. I got to meet him once ages and ages ago, at a track meet throwing shot put. It was pretty fun. I didn't know who he was. So they just introduced him as Dr. B, and then I was like, cool, nice to meet you. And then I went through shot put. If only I could travel back in time and ask him a billion questions. But so when we're looking at how do we get an idea about what it is? If I get a track athlete, right, and in our training, we'll say we'll do shot putter, because I know shot put really well, so that'll kind of tighten the scope a little bit. But in the weight room, we're lifting weights. We're trying to get bigger and stronger, because those are the things we can do really well in the weight room. And then maybe as part of the program, we're doing some plyometrics and some short sprints and stuff. if I want to get outside of that, like that basic envelope of things that we know produce a high value, for performance in sport just in general, how do I start picking out exercises? Like how do I as a coach start like inferring like, hey, we're gonna add a close grip power snatch, or we're gonna add a Ulf Timmerman used to do like a squat broad jump. And he was really complimentary to that motion. So like, how do I as a coach, how do I decide like we're gonna roll in these exercises? How many do we do at a time? How often do we try them? How do we measure to know whether or not like that is does have any kind of dynamic correspondence if we're just kind of starting out in a like we haven't done this kind of stuff before?
Yeah, so the first thing you want to do is analyze the movement in question so that you have an idea of the muscle groups involved, the joint actions involved, the speed, and then the planes of motion that you're going to be in when it occurs.
Okay.
And so by knowing the muscles involved, we can then pick exercises in the ranges of motion that are encountered in sport and train them so that you're prepared through those ranges of motion. You may also train slightly wider, like in a larger range of motion, so that you're fully prepared for anything that you encounter. You then would look at the muscle actions, your eccentric, isometric, and concentric related to the sport. You would pick exercises that have those built in to them so that they carry over more, because if you're using a muscle action, you need to train it. We're going to consider speed of movement, so how fast something is. There's many movements in sport that you can't move that fast in the gym, but
Right.
some exercises are more close than others. So if you think you go like back squat, then you go power clean, then you have plyometrics, like that's your speed continuum. Some of those are going to carry over to the speed more. And then we also want to consider what the person's doing in time and space. So not all sports occurring in the sagittal plane. So if there's frontal plane motion or if there's a rotational component and we need transverse plane movement, those would also need to be built in, because if you're going to experience it in your sport, then you're going to go ahead and do it. So you're thinking about the shot put as the athlete that you brought up. The muscles involved, it's a total body activity, but it's primarily going to be started as a lower body activity with the legs and hips. It goes up through the torso and it ends with the upper body, right? The arm releases the shot at the end of the throw. So for this reason, we now know that most of the major muscle groups in the body are going to be trained. So we're going to need to be hitting those in some context. Throwing a shot requires a very high degree of force production and power output. So we're going to have our main strength lifts. We're going to have our Olympic lifts. There's going to be plyometrics built in as well for these athletes, both upper, lower, and rotational plyometrics, because it has a speed component to it. And then we're going to pick exercises that are going to look like the angles that they're going to experience in sport. And so a good example of this, for shot putters, they do flat bench, right? But they also do incline bench, and they put the bench at the angle for the exact optimal release of the shot. So when your arm is pressing in the bench for that force production, it's in the same position that you would actually throw. So they'll adjust the bench height to be at that exact angle so that the arm is producing force through the same degrees of freedom that you're going to experience in the shot. So that would be an example of carrying over more than a flat bench press, right? Because you'd never shoot your arm straight out like a bench press throwing the shot unless you want to be very bad at the shot. So doing an incline bench is better in that context. So that's one way you would start measuring. And then you would do a monitoring program, right? That you would then come up with a way to measure, which would be throwing shots of various weights and then throwing them in different ways, like underhand and overhead shot toss for looking at explosive ability. And then you would implement your training plan and look at the resulting outcomes of what happens following training.
So one of the things that I've seen a lot in like the sport specific training portion of the world is that they'll often choose exercises that we get to a point really quickly where we can't continue to load them. Like they'll hit a progressive overload cap. So I think like I've seen been used to great success in a short period, right? So like I was talking to a coach who was talking about an athlete who had a hard time recovering from a hurdle. So they'd clear the hurdle, and then when they'd hit, it was always kind of soft, like their whole body would kind of sink into it. And so they had an exercise that they could kind of mimic that action over and over again in the weight room, kind of like a rear leg elevated, step squat, jump squat. But uh like once they learned how to do that skill, and once they could confidently contact the ground on the other side of that hurdle, how valuable is it to maintain those exercises that you've loaded them as much as you can load them before they become something else, or they you just aren't able to load them anymore? Like, when do we really need that progressive overload, and when is the exercise worth doing just because of the motor pattern and the like the crispness of execution and stuff?
Yeah, so there's like two theories on this. One's called the bottleneck approach, whereas if this item is holding you back, you need to address it to carry your progress forward.
Hmm.
So if that's holding an athlete back, then you're clearly going to address it. So in this case, the recovery over the hurdle was the bottleneck for the technique. Once they addressed it, if you remove the exercise and then they go back to their old method, then you may need to put it in as a retaining load, like in just enough to keep that pattern there.
Hmm.
However, if you address it and you remove that exercise and they retain their sporting form, it can probably be removed from the training plan at that point.
Okay.
And so you may revisit them in a cyclical fashion depending on the time of the year to reestablish those patterns, but you'll probably move on to other exercises. And that's where sequencing comes, like sequencing these exercises together to get to an end goal. At a certain point, you're going to run out of loading. So you might go from this exercise to another one where you can load heavier. It's going to be similar, but slightly different execution. And then you're going to move from there. At a certain point, the exercises become a little bit crazy and you can't load them safely or effectively. It's probably time to move on to something else and maybe throw it in sporadically to retain that physical quality, but it wouldn't be a major component of the plan.
Yeah. So when we were building programs for athletes, we were often looking at, the at least the way I've always done it, like the bulk of the training is just the good basic stuff, right? So like almost any of the sports that I like working with power athletes, right? So it's we might start the day with some short sprints and some plyos, and then we'll move into the weight room. And the weight room, there's really like 7 things that I'm going to have everybody doing some version of, right? We're going to do some kind of carries, some kind of squat, some kind of deadlift or hip hinge, some kind of overhead press, some kind of row, some kind of flat press, some kind of flat pull, right? So like we're just kind of hitting all the big compound movements, right? What percentage of the athlete's sport should be like that kind of general preparation where we're just trying to get bigger and stronger, or we're trying to get faster and more powerful? And what percentage of it should we start shifting towards the more specific sport training? I would imagine that your answer is going to vary a little bit depending on where you're at in your season, but just as kind of like, some rule of thumbs, like whatever phase you're in, how do you decide how much time? Because I've seen coaches where their entire program is sport specific, and I'm also going to use the quotes for that one because I think that that's not a great idea most of the time.
Yeah, I think as you move across the year, you're going to have a more variety of exercises that may look farther from the actual sport in question in the off season. So your program might be these specific exercises that you're choosing to fix an issue, and they might form a large portion of the workout in the off season. And then the backbone is everything that you talked about, right? So you might like be doing the specific thing to address like a hip flexor issue. So you're doing a special hip flexor exercise. And then you do that after, your sprints and plyos, and then you're into your squatting movement for that day. So the backbone of every program is going to be the foundations. And then you're going to put those exercises in when you need them. Once you fix that quality, you're going to probably move more towards the basic with less of those general exercises. And then you're going to pick ones that have a direct reason to have them in the plan that carries over. So in the off season, some of them might be built out to address a wide variety of issues, maybe 3-4 errors. Then as you get toward the middle part of the year, as you're preparing for competition, there's probably one or two glaring errors that the athlete has. You're going to pick those specific exercises there that are very targeted, and then you're going to have the main body of your workout. And then at competition time, it's just the foundations of good programming at that point. Will you have some special assistant exercises in to address them? Maybe. But at that time, you're in your sport executing at a high level. So your focus should be on getting them ready for competition. And then you're using a small grouping of exercises at that time that are going to provide the most amount of return, which are your major exercises that you already know. Jumps, the major barbell exercises, the Olympic lifts, if you put them in your program, all of those are going to be there at the end. So you're kind of going from the largest variety down to the smallest amount. That's because you're going from the least amount of sport practice to the most. So that's how you're kind of transferring across the year.
Yeah. And it is like, so one of the things that takes a while to get a handle on is like the idea of peaking. So some seasons, like you don't really peak so much in baseball, right? You just survive the season if it's 160 games or whatever. But if you're a shot putter, you've got to make it through the Olympic trials, or you want to make it at a World Games, and those things you want to tailor what you're doing really specifically as you get closer so that you can drop enough fatigue to perform really well, right? So it probably, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to be doing a lot of stuff when you're getting close to, whatever it is that your most important thing is, because at that point you should be trying to lose that fatigue so you can perform well.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
I feel like,
well, my big thing is just from my side, especially training like teams, would be also if you're a strength coach and you see something online that you like there is room to have something fun for the athletes, right? We've talked about that before. The weight room does get monotonous, especially those that are in there for like by the time they see Chris, they've probably been in the weight room for 6 or more years, but if it doesn't follow like the basic guidelines of how we know like muscles grow, make sure you're actually trying. One thing that I see a lot in football will be like they'll get their linemen into a crouch, and then like have the bar, and then they'll do right. Like one thing a tackle does is like he's kick stepping and he's punching. So they have the bar and they're right. Like, so I know in your head you think you're training some sort of push, but like the limiting factor to that would be like, can your front deltoids hold the bar up? Like well before any sort of like push is activated and you're there, like the gravity is only pointed down. So just try to, I think that's where it gets really funky is when people see your sport specific exercise and it's like, that's not, it's either not doing anything because the load isn't high enough, or you're training not even remotely to what you think that you're actually training. Like you could do that activity by banding it from behind or putting a cable, or like in our weight room, we have like
the levers,
a lever like where it's hinged above. So that actually would do it, but just try to make sure that you're doing something that like, if you think about it, like, is this actually training what, like, yes, that looks like what I'm doing on a football field, but it's not actually training anything. We're just going through a movement and training something completely different,
Yeah. I think you need to be careful taking it too far to the extreme. There was an example where they tried to build a dry land swimming device to train the swimming stroke on land. But because it's so specific to the water, it threw off their mechanics and made them worse at swimming. And so you can take these things way too far, like past its logical conclusion, and you're putting people in positions where there's no ability to produce force. And then remember that the skill of the sport is highly related to the implement that they're using in terms of like weight and speed of execution. And if you begin trying to do exercises that are too light or too heavy, it can actually throw off their skill acquisition of their sport. So it's better to treat the weight room as a general training stimulus for the acquisition and production of force that they can carry over later, and then let the sport specific exercises for the most part be dictated by the coach in the sport in question. So there are ways that you can do it that they've built out, but you have to be very careful that you're not altering their technique in a negative way because you tried to get too fancy in the gym.
Yeah. So this is a really great idea that maybe you can hit us with some common we still talk to coaches who are like, they don't want their baseball players lifting weights in season because they're afraid it's going to make them stiffer and slower. And like, there's a lot of things that are like misconceptions about how like training is going to work for you in the long run, that I think are worth just talking about. So, in that particular case, I think everybody's had the experience of starting to work out and being like, "Oh God, I couldn't get my shirt on the next day." Like we've all had that experience, but that really only happens when you first start training. Like once you get past the point where you're kind of in okay shape, there's no reason for the weight room to limit your mobility or limit your ability to perform your sport if you're just training as part of your, developmental plan, right? On a consistent basis. So what are some of the like falsehoods that you see that people take away from like sport specific training that you feel are worth like just squashing?
Yeah, you can let that one coach know that the 1950s wants their knowledge back. We've known for a long time that outside the initial phase of training, that initial delayed onset muscle soreness and stiffness that occurs resolves itself in about 2 weeks due to the repeated bout effect. And as long as you keep training, you really don't get that sore from the same type of exercises. It's only when you add in a novel exercise or stop that you get very sore. And it's quite clear now that resistance training through a full range of motion increases and retains your flexibility. So it's the exact opposite of what people think, like getting muscle bound and stiff. You can actually do that. And in some cases, if you do it properly, you don't even need to add in any extra stretching. If the athlete is already flexible enough in their resistance training, it may maintain that quality to a greater degree. So they might actually become stiffer from not resistance training and just doing baseball stuff than if they work through a full range of motion using appropriate loading and using progressive overload. Is probably going to keep them healthier in the long term. So that would be like one myth that's out there. Sometimes these drills that people do that try to mimic sport specific things are largely a waste of time. And we know that time is very limited for an athlete and across their career, but also within a season. So those would be things that you would want to get out of and get into solid basics of training. The things that we know work, gimmicks, they might work for the short term from like a novelty standpoint, but it's the foundational basics of resistance training that are going to work the best.
Yeah, I mean, 80-90% of the juice that you're going to get from that squeeze is just going to be like a good weightlifting program and a good plyometric program. Like for most sports, you're going to be checking off all them boxes. And the nice thing about doing that, I mean, some sports like you got to be careful about how much plyometric you're adding in if the athlete's in season. Like baseball's a good example, basketball's a good example where like they're going to throw a lot, they're going to jump a lot, and so if you're going to if you're going to dip your toes into the world of plyometric training in that sense, it might make sense if you realize like, oh, I have this basketball player who can't jump off his left leg, so then that intervention, you roll in a little plyometrics for them to learn how to jump off both legs and off of their left leg, and like you can kind of give them that skill acquisition piece of it without really pushing the performance piece, because they are going to do a lot of springy stuff just playing a game of basketball. But yeah, you get a huge amount. Like the more muscle you have, the more force you can produce. The more force you can produce, usually the cooler the result you're going to get in your sport, right?
Yeah.
And
I feel like a lot of that happens to be like coaches knew one guy that put on a ton of muscle, like right, like being a powerlifting coach, a lot of it comes back for whatever reason, like powerlifting is the devil compared to sports. So, and I think it's just like they see like one big, like super muscle bound man that can't itch his back. Now we know that they just are super collagened. But so don't make fun of them. But like, so I get that. Like, I don't need to necessarily like focus on that during baseball season, but that doesn't, the opposite is also bad, right? Like, so just stop lifting is an insane overcorrection of that. Like, but so, and this is one question that I have, because I have seen it quite a bit. And conceptually it makes sense, but then kind of, we were just talking to Josh Gibson again, and it was interesting because he didn't say the opposite, but it was kind of the opposite. And that's like, in your like golfers, or I guess it would be a little bit like shot putters or discus or baseball players, like they have a lot of rotations like in one general pattern, which like if you looked at it, like that's setting up a ton of like imbalance in the body, right? Because we like how many times we're taking a swing this direction. Like even if you programmed like opposite level swings, like you're never going to make up that level
Right,
of
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 intensity.
intensity or just volume. Like, all right, we're doing, you know, a set of 150 like banded wood chops this direction. Like you're just never going to get there. Like, but is that something that you try to do, or do you just understand that in a golfer or a baseball player they're going to have these imbalances, and if you do the opposite, can we be affecting their swing? Like, I don't, at your guys' level, do you see the like coaches trying to correct that by going opposite, or like you were just saying, like by trying to do that, am I then impeding their ability to swing? Like, am I messing their groove up essentially? Like,
I don't think the general activities that you would do would affect their golf swing in that way, as long as you're not trying to make it too specific. But when you go into training, especially for rotational athletes, you're going to train both ways, to the left and right when you're doing any rotational. So you're going to be doing that. You're going to be doing single leg work and probably single arm work on both sides in the off season, trying to do that. But it's important to note that there are going to be asymmetries in the body when it comes to these sports. It just depends to what degree and how much it carries over to performance. And we wouldn't expect the sides to line up, but we're
right,
still going to train both of them from an injury reduction standpoint. We don't want one side to get so strong compared to the other. But you're not going to be able to fix it, just like you said. Like you're not going to be able to go give them a left-handed golf club and have them swing the opposite way to try and balance the body out. That would probably screw up their swing, trying to do it the other way. But knowing that the gym can help to round out those imbalances. I work with weightlifters. When you do the split jerk, you always use the same
right,
leg forward to lift the most amount of weight. So when I go into some off-season training, we'll do single leg work with them, and I'll often have them press from the split with the opposite leg forward so that it trains that side of the body, the oblique and the hip flexor on the opposite side in the off season, just to prevent those things from coming up, knowing that I'm not going to have them do split jerks with the opposite leg because they're not going to do that ever in competition.
right,
Yeah. I think it's also important to know to like think about the context of what we're talking about too. Like if just doing the sport was enough to get you to be a really athletic 340-pound shot putter, then people wouldn't lift weights. Like it's not that good of a growth stimulus. So like a lot of times the work that you can do in the weight room goes a long ways towards balancing those things out because it is a stimulus that's intense enough to cause your body to change. Whereas if you're just swinging a golf club or just throwing a shot put, eventually like the stimulus that you're going to get out of that's going to start to cap out, and you can
Yeah,
go way beyond that in the weight room than
hmm,
what you would get from your sport. So, you know,
exactly.
um, God, I feel like I have a billion. I have so many questions that I'm having a hard time
coming up
organizing
with a
my
question.
brain. Yeah, like that just it's just going a million miles an hour. I got a garage full of hamsters going on right now. Um, so getting back to like misconceptions that people often have. So there's often the, it'll make them tight or it'll make them slow. That we don't really have anything to support that, right? That has been one of the cool things that's come out of research the last few years is the idea that like we can actually reinforce good ranges of motion, right? So like if you just stretch, it's hard to actually get improvements in mobility. But if you stretch and then you follow it up with a squat or a single leg press or a pull down or something where you're moving through that range of motion and you're showing your body that it's safe, that it's actually a good way to improve your mobility. And I think that's been a really cool thing that's come out. Um, can you tell us a little bit? Because I think that this is really fading, and I'm glad that it's fading. But when I was a kid, they would always make you do like long static stretching before you would exercise. And so I would make myself scarce when we had a big track meet and they were like, all right, it's team warm up. I'd be like, all right, I got to go to the bathroom because I hated doing a big stretch and then going and trying to throw the shot put. It felt like a terrible thing. So, what are some of the things that we've seen, like that people kind of do as part of their sport practice? Like Josh already mentioned the idea of not matching your load vectors. So, like if you're pressing a bar horizontally, the work that you're doing is resisting the up and down, not so much the back and forth, right? So we want to be sure that when we do sport specific exercise, that whatever the direction is that we're moving is where the resistance is. But what are the other things? Like, could you talk a little bit about the role of stretching and power performance? And like, are there other things that you can think of that we've been putting in the wrong spot in our programs? Like, I'm not saying stretching's bad. Like, it's, you know, it certainly can have a really productive role, but like, it probably shouldn't be right before your maximum power output, right? So could you talk a little bit about that and then other things that we might be missing?
Yeah, so that one was just big from conventional carryover from people historically stretching before to try and prevent muscle strains. But as the research has caught up, we know that really intensive static stretching before an event can actually reduce power production and force production because you're telling the muscle to relax and then contract as hard and as fast as you can. These are competing things, and that is not what you want. So before an event, the best way to stretch is to do dynamic stretches or even ballistic stretches that don't hold an end range. You can static stretch if something is very stiff,
Right.
but you just wouldn't want to do it aggressively for a long period of time. And you would want to follow it up with some ballistic activities and then some dynamic warm-ups. It seems to get rid of some of that negative effect. But static stretching is best served later in the workout because that could definitely reduce your force production. So intrinsically, you did the right thing for your performance. You disappeared during static stretching, and you probably were better at the shot put because of that.
Yeah.
But by doing a well-structured general warm-up and some ballistic exercises, you can actually make performance better by going through the range of motion and getting warm. So that would be one. Sometimes coaches make you run after practice or the next day to get the lactic acid out of your muscles, which we now know is not the case. So you do build up metabolic waste products from training. Most of them are cleared in about 30 minutes to an hour after training if you didn't do anything at all. Like your body's just going to clear it. They don't like it sitting there. By doing a dynamic cool down, you can speed up the removal of those waste products. But the next day, going for a jog is not removing any waste products.
Just making
It
more.
may make you feel better because of the blood flow to the muscle that you're doing, but not because your coach is telling you that the lactic acid that got stuck in there is making you sore and not feel good. So it may have made you feel better, but not for the reasons that your coach talked about. But now we know that you could just go into the weight room and just do like empty barbell work. And then any of the muscles that are sore from delayed onset muscle soreness, you're sending blood to that area. And that can aid in recovery, helping you feel better. And it's not going to speed up the process, but getting blood in the area is going to get more nutrients there. So that can help out. So that's one of those older things that people still talk about, like flushing out the lactic acid. It's like, that's not a thing.
Yeah. And I want to be real clear that I'm not anti warm up. Like your muscular system's viscoelastic, so the hotter it is, the better it's going to perform, right? So,
correct.
Don't take that don't try to give yourself like malaria so you can show up at 108 degrees. That'd be a bad idea, but like warming up is definitely good for performance.
But a lot of times, like just, in the weight room, like your warm up can be the activity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So like my kids warm up pretty specifically. Most of them are just dynamic, little quick dynamic stretches. We warm up what we're going to be warming up, and then we just do warm up sets.
Yeah.
And that's usually good enough.
So I'm really curious about this because this is something I've heard I've heard a few different people talk about recovery methods, right? For sport. And they kind of vary from the advice that you're giving, which is like a little bit of like light exercise to get the blood flowing again. Even all the way down to just like a 10-minute walk or something, just do a little bit. So there's a lot of people who I've heard that's probably the move you can make if you want to do something to improve your recovery. The other one that I've heard is just shut up and don't do anything. Just go lay down. Are those like actually competing ideas? Are they both good? Is one more effective than the other in the literature in terms of like trying to get yourself ready for the next practice and the next training and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so one you're talking about is passive recovery, is just the passage of time and resting and recovery. And then the other is what we call active recovery, where you do very light workouts.
Yeah.
As long as they're not too strenuous, they can help. Sometimes athletes tend to overdo it, right? So you go in for like a little warm up active recovery session and then it becomes like a mini workout. That's not going to aid in recovery and not serve the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of have to know the athlete in question. Sometimes you can get quite stiff, or sore from training, and then doing something can make you feel better, even
Mm-hmm.
if it's just subjectively feeling better. So for those athletes going in and maybe doing a little bit of mobility, a little bit of walking and moving around makes them feel better, and then they're prepped for their next session or practice you have, that would be good. It's just you don't want to take away from them. So when you start to add in more things that are eating up more energy, you're removing from the process of recovering. So you're not aiding to the recovery process. So that's where you have to be careful and strike a balance between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the football team, what we had moved or what I moved to 2 years ago, which I think it fills all these things. I just noticed that by even bringing them into the weight room, like to do active recovery, they're not good. It kind of was twofold. They're not good at doing like super light band stuff. Like they're high school boys for the most part in that group. They want to put weight on, and it started for me developing the idea that it was all right to be like super lazy and lackadaisical inside the weight room, which I didn't like. Like I like that.
You only get hot or cold.
I like that to be like a place of business. Once they walk in, it's a place of business. So what I did was just switch them to. We just do like 15 to 20 minute ultra easy. I throw them in the pool, and we walk down and back. We do a light swim down and back. We do some high knees, some butt kicks. So it's ultra easy, low resistance, but you are moving the whole body through. And then we're done. It went from being like an hour and 30-minute thing when I started 10 years ago. Like the morning was a run and a lift and, and field work, to they watch film 15 to 20 in the pool, really probably 15 in the pool. And then they were gone and the results were way better. Like the kids were way more fresh on Monday. There was better adherence to showing up on a Saturday, like if we're working anything out, at least with my clientele, it's trying to work off the hangover. It's for Saturday morning.
Oh yeah.
No, high school kids don't drink.
Never. So when you are talking about kind of that recovery piece of it, because it is an important part of training, right? I know that doing too much has always been kind of my Achilles heel. Like I always want to go heavier. I always want to do more. Even when I started doing deloads, I was always doing too much weight and, too many reps. And it was like, I got to the point where when it was a deload, I was like, I'm going to start out by taking my deload, and my deload week is just going to be a week off. Like, because I need to like recondition myself that it's okay to like take it easy, because they would always end up being too much. So the work that we do is a stimulus, right? But the change doesn't happen in the weight room. It happens when we're eating and sleeping and doing all that good stuff. The big pieces for recovery, right, are enough food, the right protein intake, depending on the thing that you're doing. Like carbs have kind of been king for a long time in terms of engendering performance and growth and everything. You can do a little lower carb depending on like what your specific, what you're training for and stuff. But so, your food, your quality food, your sleep is super, super clutch. Can you walk us through a little bit on the recovery side of things? There's a lot of alternative things, right? Like people will go in for acupuncture and they have like electronic devices and they have massage and like what are I've seen, it seems to me like kind of globally those things are good because they get the athlete to just sit down or lay down and just relax for half an hour, like at a level that they wouldn't do in their day-to-day life. They would fill their day, even if they were sitting down, they'd be playing video games, which are still, a source of stress, right? Because our body's not really great at differentiating stresses, right? So like they're good because they're true rest, right? They're really just sitting down and doing nothing for a little bit. And then two, frequently because somebody's caring for them. That seems to be a big factor in terms of whether or not something's going to have a positive outcome for somebody else, because we're social creatures and we like knowing that somebody cares about us. Is there a little more fidelity to that in terms of like some of these modalities are really good, some of them are not so good when we are looking at those special recovery tools?
Yeah, so most commonly now, due to the internet and influencers, you're seeing cold baths.
Yeah.
Cold baths work. They reduce inflammation. However, that's a two-edged sword. If you're shooting for adaptations, we need some inflammation to be present. So doing a cold bath when you're trying to get larger and stronger is not a great idea because the inflammation resulting from training is necessary to adapt from training. When you would want to use ice baths are during a congested season when you have multiple games during a week and you want to feel better. Do we care about maximizing muscle size and strength in between a 3-game week for an athlete? Absolutely not. We want them to recover, feel better, and to get rid of that inflammation so that they can execute at a high level later in the week. So cold baths are situational from when you would need them. If it's in the deep off season, probably leave them out. It's okay to be sore. You want that inflammation to be there so that you can adapt to the stimulus. And they've shown that cold baths consistently over time reduce the remodeling process, which results in less muscle growth. And then the resultant outcome is less force production. You're not as strong. Emerging evidence is coming out about hot, so like hot tubs, the sauna, and heat shock proteins being more beneficial for recovery, but it has to be built up. You have to work that into it and do it consistently because initially it's a stressor. Then as your body adapts in the first few weeks, it becomes less of a stress and then it can become a positive. But you can't just throw someone in the sauna and expect a good result. It has to be implemented in as you go because that heat shock
during the peak.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So if you're going to use it, weightlifters use it all the time to cut weight, but they use it most of the year, so they're ready for it. You wouldn't just implement it at the end. So that would be like the exact opposite of the cold baths. You'd want to hold off on using those, whereas if you're using heat, you want to do it early and often to be used to it so that the stress is minimal on the athlete. Then you have things like what you got. You have massage being a recovery method. Probably important for like muscle and tendon health and making the athlete subjectively feel better. Doesn't tend to show like short-term performance outcomes other than maybe helping the athlete relax, right? If it's a relaxing thing that could help. The evidence is pretty mixed on massage. What else is out there? Massage guns, pretty much like using a foam roller. Doesn't really do anything except short-term improvements. What else am I missing? Compression gear doesn't seem to show very much promising outcomes as it relates to performance.
Yeah.
You can use them when you're traveling to prevent swelling in the limbs, but doesn't seem to be a major mover of performance. So, which ones am I missing here?
One thing you see a lot, it was really kind of hit, probably it was like 8 years ago or something, but it was at the Olympics, and you saw, it was one of the top swimmers, Lochte maybe, and he came with like the cupping bruises.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like before that was really a more popular thing, and everybody was like, what the hell? It looked like he'd been beaten with a stick.
Yep.
So like, is that something that, cupping, acupuncture, those kind of things?
Acupuncture is placebo effect. It doesn't really do anything. Dry needling actually works because it's actually going into the muscle. And then cupping, it can make athletes subjectively feel better, but there's no performance outcome. So cupping, the mechanisms that they state that it's doing, it's not really necessarily doing it. So if the athlete feels better from doing it and it's not causing a negative, then I'm okay with them using the modality. So if acupuncture, they use it, it makes them feel better. Acupuncture is not going to make them worse.
Right.
It's just not going to do anything, but don't tell them that, because then it removes the placebo effect when you tell them it's not working.
Well, they get
other things you wouldn't want them to do because it will make them worse. Like an ice bath will make them actively worse. Cupping is not going to make them worse. It'll just make them not look the best, but it's not going to harm their performance. So that's how I weigh out the pros and cons of recovery methods.
Yeah, to me, cupping and acupuncture kind of always fit that role of like you are required to lay down and relax for half an hour, and somebody's taking care of you. Which both have big impacts, right? Like they're both things that show an outcome.
So
compassion and Yeah, compassion and healing touch is a big impact on recovery, and it's
Mhm.
likely that aspect is what's making them better, not the actual mechanism.
And we've talked about this before, like the act of going and paying for the cupping or whatever, like the act of taking your own free time and doing cupping is just yet another. And it might not be at your level because you're dealing with college athletes. They're already like dedicated to what they're doing. But more like at our level, when we have like clientele, it's something other than the lifting that they're proving to themselves that I'm in.
Another level of
I'm
buy-in.
gonna train and I'm gonna go hard. Like, is there even a level for you? Let's say I had a client that doesn't really lift a whole lot. They're not necessarily worried about getting maximal level gains, but they do wake up and get in a cold tub every day, and that itself is like the one thing that gets them to move around. Is there like, could you see that being like, okay, if that's the thing that makes you feel tough inside and you're like, I started the day and I'm, you know what I mean, I'm gonna go to the gym, like, is there like the trade-off, like, all right, dude, it's not the smartest thing and you might lose a little bit on the
In the
top
long run,
end.
yeah.
But if that's what gets you to post your story on Instagram and you're out there and you're trying real hard, like, could you see that, Chris, like being a thing, like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe I even let them know, like, hey, we are missing some gains here, but if that's the thing that gets you there, again, if it's working, let's not break it, you know.
Layered on top of everything about training is consistency and getting buy-in. And if that's the factor that gets someone to buy in, knowing the trade-offs, go ahead and jump in the ice bath
Yeah.
every day. If that's how it gets you started and it sets your day up for success, and then you just maybe miss out on a little bit of growth, like it doesn't really matter because you got in and got it done.
Right.
And so layered on top of everything that we're talking about is the consistency and the routine of training. And one thing to remember is, you have 1 hour of training a day, and then you have 23 hours a day to screw it up.
Yeah.
So if you are doing that as an anchor point and it sets your day up for success, and then one thing follows after another, I would take that trade-off. Now, if it's a very high-level athlete,
Right.
we are probably going to have a different conversation because it may have a negative impact
Yeah.
on their performance in the long term. But if it's a regular person you're just trying to get buy-in, yeah, let's go ahead and do that because their end goal is to not win this competition. It's to be better at life. And if a cold bath sets them up, we're going to throw it in.
And we've talked about this before, but really that line should be drawn like anytime you're getting information from anybody, it goes back to the studies, it goes back to anything. Like if you're only taking your advice from people that are training high level athletes, like that might not translate to you. If you're taking all your advice and you're lifting twice a day because that's what Ronnie Coleman did or that's what Arnold did, you might not have the same supplementation that allowed them to train hard twice a day and recover. So you need to make sure that you're listening to people that are specifically talking to you. And there's plenty of influencers out there that are intelligent and that do use you as a niche. So just find your people and train that way. Quit,
Yeah.
like you're not Dwayne the Rock Johnson.
I'm not.
No,
What?
no. Like you're not Mr. Collagen, right? Not everybody could be me.
Like you.
Yeah, you're
Just
not one
rigid.
of the. You're not a fascist. You're not one of the fascists. You might be a fascist. I don't know, but
I'm sure that Instagram handle will
PM.
be taken.
probably by not nice people. I should probably stop plugging it.
yeah. Don't go there. Don't go there.
It's all a joke.
Yeah, one of the things that's like always important is that every bit of advice that we give in this domain is always conditional, right? Like it always depends. And one of the really great things about lifting or training in general is the fact that doing hard things makes hard things easier. Like just as a human, just as a developing person, right? Like I'm not going to knock an ice bath because I don't want to get in one. If you're getting in one every day, you're tougher than I am. I don't want to do it, you know? And so like if that's part of your, part of your system, part of your get ready for the world, have at.
Good. Do
Enjoy it. Enjoy it. Red light therapy was the other one.
That one I'm gonna have to pass on because I don't know enough about it. I know
Okay.
that there's some limited evidence about it working.
Uh-huh.
There's a mechanism between the light and blood flow, but that's outside my scope of knowledge. So I wouldn't want to give an opinion
Right.
one way or the other and sway people there.
Yeah. There's always there's always something. So like if you're in this space and you're kind of newer to this space and you're like, oh, this guy's got a red light machine and this guy's got an ice bath and this guy's got a sauna, like there's never gonna be an end. In a few years, there's gonna be new stuff all the time, and then you usually find that it blows up and it's something giant, and then they realize like, oh, actually it's really good in these cases, and otherwise, maybe not as important. Just over the last few years, do you want to talk a little bit about blood flow restriction training, about how that kind of has its arc over the last 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, so blood flow restriction training sounds kind of crazy when you first see it. You're applying a tourniquet essentially to a limb. You're occluding the blood flow and you're creating a hypoxic environment in the muscle. And so it really started out in the rehab setting because you can lift relatively light loads and get a robust effect in the muscle. And then it made it into the world of sports performance. So blood flow restriction really has gone from like clinical to a performance side. And it's still used in rehab now. So blood flow restriction, it's not used for recovery. It's actually used as a training modality, and it can help to restore like lost muscle mass due to atrophy after an injury, because you don't have to lift very heavy. You can lift as light as like 10% of your max and still get robust responses because it creates such a stress on the muscle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's been really interesting to see, like, I've seen it like over the last 5 or 6 years. I had first read about it, like you were saying, as an injury recovery, and then it was like all of a sudden everybody was doing it, and you could find the cuffs and stuff everywhere. And then all of a sudden, just in like the last year, I feel like it's lost a lot of momentum, and that might just be my impression, but like a lot more people are going back to just lifting weights. Like I'd see them in, they'd have the cuffs on their arms or the cuffs on their legs, every workout for 10 or 12 weeks, and then eventually they were like, yeah, it works, it's fun, but like I can also just keep training.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily know that I would recommend tourniqueting your body parts without like a trained professional monitoring.
That's because you're not committed.
Well, it's because I enjoy having my body parts.
Yeah, it definitely is around in a rehab setting. It's really used in physical therapy now.
Yeah,
I think it's drifted out of the performance world. It can be taken too far. People have had problems using it, like with blood clotting and things, taking it to the extreme. But again, it's just an adjunct to training. It's probably not a main training method, but it definitely has situational aspects in which you would use it. So it seems kind of gimmicky, but it's a known thing. It's been studied for a long time.
Yeah.
And the effects are now known pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really cool. Like the idea, like the fact that it works at all is a pretty fun. Like there haven't been very many of those like biohacks that have turned out to, be effective. But if you think about what you're going to be doing across, like I've done it, it's uncomfortable, right? Like when you cuff your arm and then go to failure on something for 20 reps or whatever, it's like you're not going to have a good time. It's going to feel bad.
No.
And like the idea that you're going to go into the weight room and do that like every workout is something that, isn't always going to be super sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I think, we got any other questions? Did we do a good job?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I mean, we're pushing the record here.
Yeah.
I may have set the record with you guys today.
Yeah.